We never stood a chance. Captain Tameichi Hara sat in the dim wardroom of his destroyer, hand trembling as he wrote the sentence that would haunt him forever. The Americans fired shells as if ammunition cost nothing, while we counted every single round as if it were made of gold. It was 1952, 7 years after the war's end. Hara had survived what few Japanese naval officers did, fighting from the first night at Guadalcanal in 1942 to the final desperate actions off Okinawa in 1945. He'd commanded destroyers in over 20 major engagements, watched friends die, seen mighty battleships reduced to burning hulks. But what shocked him most wasn't American courage or Japanese sacrifice. It was the sheer, incomprehensible abundance of American ammunition. He remembered November 12, 1942, off Guadalcanal. His destroyer had engaged American cruisers in a point-blank brawl in darkness. The Americans fired as if possessed, tracers lighting up the night in continuous streams, shell splashes creating forests of waterspouts, guns thundering without end. His crew fired carefully, deliberately, each salvo calculated with precision. They'd won that night, but Hara remembered the stunned silence afterward when his gunnery officer calculated American ammunition expenditure. The numbers seemed impossible. A single American cruiser had fired more shells in 30 minutes than Hara's destroyer carried in its entire magazine. "Surely the calculations are wrong," Hara had said. His gunnery officer, a precise man who never made errors, simply shook his head. "I rechecked 3 times, Captain. Those are the numbers." That was when Hara first understood they were fighting a different kind of war. The Imperial Japanese Navy had trained for the decisive battle, one climactic engagement where superior skill would overcome material disadvantage. But the Americans weren't fighting that way. They were fighting a war of grinding attrition, where material abundance simply overwhelmed qualitative superiority through sheer, relentless mathematics. 2 philosophies of war. Japanese naval doctrine was elegant, sophisticated, and perfectly adapted to fighting a war that would never happen. Every aspect emphasized individual excellence and careful planning. Gunnery practice focused on precision. Japanese gunners spent countless hours learning to estimate range by eye, calculate deflection angles mentally, fire accurately from unstable platforms. Their optical equipment was superb. Their rangefinders could calculate distances with remarkable accuracy. Every sailor was expected to be worth 2 or 3 American counterparts. Every shell had to count because there wouldn't be unlimited resupply. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe remembered his pre-war training. "We were taught that ammunition was precious, that every shell represented the labor of dozens of workers, the sacrifice of resources our nation could ill afford to waste. Firing unnecessarily was not just tactically foolish, it was almost morally wrong." This created officers who were extraordinarily disciplined, highly skilled, and fundamentally unprepared for actual combat. The problem wasn't that Japanese doctrine was wrong. It would have worked brilliantly in the decisive battle they envisioned. The problem was that Americans refused to fight that battle. American naval doctrine represented the opposite philosophy. American officers were products of an industrial society where abundance was normal. They'd grown up where production could always be increased, where running short was a temporary problem rather than existential crisis. Commander Ernest Evans, who later commanded the destroyer USS Johnston, once told his crew, "We don't count shells, boys. We count hits. You see a target, you shoot until it's dead or you can't see it anymore. Let the supply officers worry about ammunition. That's their job. Your job is to put steel on target." This attitude horrified Japanese officers. To them, it seemed criminally wasteful. But to Americans, it made perfect sense. Why risk a perfect shot that might miss when you could fire 10 shots and guarantee hits? Why treat ammunition as precious when factories could replace anything used? By 1943, American doctrine had fully embraced saturation tactics. Pre-invasion bombardments evolved into multi-day affairs where battleships fired thousands of rounds at small islands. The bombardment of Iwo Jima saw 22,000 shells onto an island just 8 square miles. Officers noted expenditures that would have horrified any other navy. Pillbox destroyed after 47 rounds. Bunker neutralized with 23 rounds. Anti-aircraft doctrine illustrated this most clearly. By 1944, American ships created volumes of airspace so filled with steel that aircraft couldn't survive passing through them. They didn't aim at individual planes. Attacks came too fast. Instead, they created kill zones where overlapping explosions made survival statistically improbable. A single task force might expend tens of thousands of rounds in minutes, creating what Japanese pilots called clouds of steel or thunderstorms made of fire. The hidden front. While navies clashed in the Pacific, the decisive campaign was being fought in Independence, Missouri, Hastings, Nebraska, and Radford, Virginia, places most Americans had never heard of. The Lake City Army ammunition plant in Independence covered nearly 4,000 acres, employed over 20,000 workers at peak production, and operated 24/7 producing small arms ammunition at fantastical rates. Martha Simmons was 19 when she started work at Lake City in March 1942. She'd grown up on a farm, never worked in a factory. But her brother was in the Marines. He'd survived Pearl Harbor and written home about needing ammunition. So Martha traveled to Independence, took training, and found herself operating a machine seating primers in brass cartridge cases. The noise was unbelievable, she remembered decades later. Thousands of machines running at once, presses slamming with huge hydraulic pressure, conveyor belts moving cartridges in continuous streams. You couldn't talk normally, you had to shout into someone's ear. The smell, brass and oil and chemicals, got into everything. The work was repetitive but demanding. Each primer had to be seated perfectly. Too loose meant misfires, too tight might detonate during seating, taking the operator's hand or life. Martha's machine had safeguards, but accidents happened. In her first month, 2 workers died in accidental detonations. The factory kept operating. Memorial services during shift changes. New workers hired. Production continued. By mid-1943, Lake City produced over 10 million rounds daily. 10 million rounds. Every day. An endless river of brass and lead flowing into wooden crates, onto trucks, to rail yards, across the country to ports, across the Pacific to soldiers who fired them without ever thinking about the teenage girl in Missouri who'd assembled those particular cartridges. Martha's brother survived Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu. He came home in 1945 with malaria and nightmares but alive. He told Martha about firefights where they'd fired so many rounds that rifle barrels glowed red. About machine gunners going through entire belts in seconds. About never worrying about ammunition because there was always more. Did you ever think where all those bullets came from? Martha asked. Her brother admitted he hadn't. To most American servicemen, ammunition just existed in abundance because America was abundant. The invisible infrastructure that made this possible was completely taken for granted. The Naval Ammunition Depot at Hastings, Nebraska, built on 49,000 acres of prairie starting in 1942, was a city unto itself. By 1943, it had 2,400 buildings connected by 150 miles of roads and 50 miles of railroad track. It employed 6,500 workers loading, assembling, and shipping naval shells around the clock. The scale was difficult to comprehend. Buildings the size of aircraft hangars filled floor to ceiling with shells. Explosive compounds arriving by trainload, TNT from Tennessee, ammonium picrate from Pennsylvania, composition B from Louisiana. Brass casings from mills that had been making plumbing fixtures before Pearl Harbor. Everything converging at Hastings, transformed into 5-inch anti-aircraft shells, 8-inch cruiser rounds, 16-inch battleship projectiles. Dorothy Chun worked in Building 47, where explosive filler was poured into shells. The composition B had to be heated to approximately 180 degrees Fahrenheit, but much hotter meant spontaneous detonation. Pouring had to avoid air pockets. Cooling had to be slow and even. We knew one mistake could kill everyone in the building, Dorothy remembered. Maybe several buildings if it set off a chain reaction. But we also knew every shell might save an American life somewhere. So you focused, did the work, followed every safety protocol, and prayed. In 3 years, Hastings produced millions of naval shells. Estimates suggest the facility alone outproduced the entire Japanese naval ammunition industry by 5-1. And Hastings was just one of multiple major plants operating across the United States. The logistics of moving ammunition from America's heartland to the Pacific was itself a triumph. Shells packed in crates, loaded onto rail cars, shipped to West Coast ports, transferred to ammunition ships. Floating bombs that everyone knew were dangerous. Strict protocols. No smoking anywhere aboard, temperature and humidity monitored, cargo secured elaborately. At forward bases like Ulithi Atoll, entire anchorages were devoted to ammunition ships. Warships would pull alongside for transfer operations. A battleship that had expended thousands of rounds could expect complete resupply within days, sometimes hours if urgent. The entire system, production, transportation, storage, distribution, operated with remarkable efficiency. It never failed. The Pacific Fleet never experienced ammunition shortages that affected operations. Ships always had shells. The pipeline never ran dry. Rising sun, setting reserves. Japan's ammunition situation presented the opposite picture. Sophisticated planning gradually overwhelmed by impossible logistics and dwindling resources. The Kokura Arsenal on Kyushu was one of Japan's premier facilities. In 1941, operating at full capacity, Kokura produced approximately 5,000 large-caliber naval shells monthly, roughly 60,000 annually. This was impressive efficiency. The problem was scale. Kokura was among Japan's largest arsenals. The entire Japanese military-industrial complex, mobilized for total war at maximum capacity, produced in a year what American facilities like Hastings produced in months. While American production increased throughout the war, Japanese production peaked in 1943, then began inexorable decline. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, who led the Pearl Harbor attack, later wrote, "We were like a man fighting a flood with buckets, while our opponent had pumps and dams. We worked as hard, as efficiently as possible, but the mathematics made defeat inevitable. We simply couldn't produce enough of anything. Ammunition, fuel, replacement aircraft, trained pilots. The industrial gap wasn't just large. It was of a different order of magnitude. Material composition revealed growing desperation. Early war shells were well-made, high-quality steel, precise machining, sophisticated explosives, reliable fuses. A 1941 shell from Kokura matched American quality. But as resources became scarce, quality deteriorated. Steel quality declined first. Japan imported most steel-making materials from Manchuria and Southeast Asia. As American submarines interdicted supply lines, mills worked with increasingly inferior ores, producing steel with more impurities, less consistency, reduced strength. Shell casings from degraded steel were weaker, more prone to fracturing, occasionally failing catastrophically in gun barrels. To conserve metal, shells were made with thinner walls, reducing effectiveness and increasing premature detonation risk. Explosive fillers became less powerful as chemical precursors grew scarce. Japan never developed large-scale synthetic explosive industry like America's. As supplies dwindled, arsenals used inferior substitutes, reducing effectiveness and reliability. The brass shortage became acute by 1943. Japan had limited copper production and imported most from China and Southeast Asia. As supply lines were cut, brass became desperately scarce. The government launched systematic collection campaigns, requisitioning anything copper alloy from civilians. Most notorious were campaigns targeting Buddhist temples. Thousands of temples had bronze bells, some centuries old, priceless cultural artifacts. These were systematically removed and sent to foundries, melted down and recast into shell casings. Reverend Tanaka Shoichi witnessed his temple's bell being removed in 1944. That bell had hung in our temple since 1633. It had rung for every emperor's death, every major disaster, every significant event. My father had rung it, his father before him, back through 13 generations. The military officers who came looked uncomfortable, apologized for the necessity, treated the bell respectfully. But they took it anyway. 3 centuries of tradition melted down for a few hundred brass casings. Even with desperate measures, there wasn't enough. By 1945, some Japanese ammunition used steel cartridge cases, which worked poorly, caused extraction problems, accelerated weapon wear. Quality control slipped as experienced workers were drafted and replaced with hastily trained substitutes. Primers became unreliable. Propellants deteriorated, especially in tropical climates, losing power and consistency. Lieutenant Haruki Iki, a gunnery officer on the cruiser Tone, kept detailed records. By late 1944, I estimated approximately 8 to 10% of our main battery ammunition was unreliable. Duds, short rounds from weak propellant, occasional premature detonations. We had to factor these failures into gunnery calculations, making accurate fire control nearly impossible. How do you aim effectively when one shell in 10 won't perform as expected? Japan was fighting across an empire from Burma to the Central Pacific, trying to supply garrisons on hundreds of scattered islands. The logistics were nightmarish before American submarines made resupply lethal. By late 1943, more ammunition was being sent to the bottom of the Pacific than reached frontline units. Midnight convoys. The Tokyo Express, called Rat Runs by Americans, represented both tactical innovation and strategic desperation. Unable to operate cargo ships during daylight when American aircraft dominated, the Japanese Navy converted fastest destroyers into improvised transports. Commander Toshihisa Abe commanded the destroyer Kasumi during multiple Tokyo Express runs to Guadalcanal in late 1942. His posthumously published recollections provide vivid description. We would load at Rabaul during daylight, ammunition, food, medical supplies, occasionally troops. Everything stored on deck, in passageways, anywhere we could find space. A destroyer has limited cargo capacity, perhaps 8 tons, maybe 10 if we packed creatively. A proper transport could carry 100 tons, but transports couldn't survive where we were going. We'd depart at dusk, running south at maximum speed, 30 knots or faster. The goal was arriving at Guadalcanal during the darkest hours between midnight and 3 a.m. We'd heave supplies overboard in sealed drums, hoping shore parties could recover them, or occasionally make brief stops to offload directly. Then we'd race back north, trying to reach air cover before dawn when American aircraft would find us. The runs were terrifying. We knew American cruisers and destroyers patrolled those waters. We knew submarines waited along our routes. Every night might end in sudden combat, torpedoes in darkness, shells tearing through thin hulls. And for what? 8 tons of supplies, delivered at enormous risk. We lost destroyers, valuable fleet units, acting as glorified cargo vessels because there was no other way. I remember calculating one night that in 1 month, we delivered perhaps 200 tons to Guadalcanal while losing 2 destroyers and their crews, roughly 500 men. A single cargo ship could have carried that much in one voyage. But cargo ships couldn't survive, so we ran supplies in destroyers and bled the fleet slowly. The inefficiency was staggering but unavoidable. Destroyers burned fuel oil, itself desperately scarce, at prodigious rates during high-speed runs. Fuel that could have been used for fleet operations was consumed running supplies. Destroyers that should have been training or screening carrier forces were being sunk as transports. The Tokyo Express was tactically clever but strategically disastrous, symptomatic of logistical collapse. Even when supplies reached their destination, quantities were insufficient. Guadalcanal's garrison numbered approximately 30,000 men at peak. They needed food, medical supplies, weapons, and above all, ammunition. A typical division in sustained combat might expend several hundred tons of ammunition daily. The Tokyo Express, optimistically, might deliver 50 tons weekly. The arithmetic made disaster inevitable. Battle off Samar. Abundance meets desperation. The battle off Samar on October 25, 1944, showcased the ammunition disparity in its most dramatic form. Japanese battleships and cruisers, including the massive battleship Yamato, unexpectedly encountered Taffy 3, a group of 6 small American escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. On paper, it was a massacre waiting to happen. Japanese ships outgunned, out-armored, and outweighed the Americans absurdly. Yamato alone displaced more than all of Taffy 3's ships combined and carried guns that could obliterate any American vessel with a single hit. Sprague's destroyers and destroyer escorts charged directly at the Japanese battle line, firing torpedoes and guns in what should have been suicidal sacrifice to buy time for carriers to escape. The USS Johnston, under Commander Ernest Evans, fired so many 5-inch shells her crew couldn't remember an accurate count. Estimates exceeded 200 rounds per gun, essentially her entire ready ammunition and everything they could bring up while under fire. She fired all 10 torpedoes, scored hits on the heavy cruiser Kumano, raked Japanese ships with 40mm and 20mm fire that couldn't penetrate armor but added confusion. The USS Hull exhausted her ammunition similarly. Every torpedo, every 5-inch shell, firing continuously even as Japanese shells tore through her thin armor. The USS Samuel B. Roberts, a tiny destroyer escort never meant for fleet actions, engaged the heavy cruiser Chokai at ranges where American 5-inch guns could be effective, firing over 600 rounds from her 2 main battery guns before they literally blew themselves apart from continuous shooting, barrels warped from firing at maximum rate. This profligate expenditure, which would have horrified Japanese supply officers, was possible because Sprague's ship's new ammunition was available. Replenishment was possible if they survived. They fired everything they had because they could get more. The psychological freedom this provided can't be overstated. Gunnery officers didn't calculate remaining ammunition and ration shots. They fired as fast as guns could cycle, kept firing until magazines were empty or the ship was sinking, trusted that if they survived, more shells would be provided. The Japanese ships, by contrast, showed more restraint even in what should have been a target-rich environment. They were careful with main battery ammunition, selecting targets deliberately, firing controlled salvos rather than rapid fire. Part was doctrine. Japanese gunnery emphasized precision over volume. But part was ingrained conservation born of years of supply constraints. Even here, with American carriers almost within range and destroyers pressing suicidal attacks, Japanese gunners fired carefully, selected targets, avoided wasteful expenditure. The battle ended with 3 of Sprague's destroyers and destroyer escorts sunk, 1 escort carrier sunk, others damaged, but the Japanese retreating before they destroyed the entire force. Multiple factors contributed to Admiral Kurita's decision to withdraw: confusion about what he was facing, concern about aerial attacks, worry about American battleships that might be approaching. But ammunition was part of the calculation. His ships had expended significant portions of their magazines, not knowing when resupply would be possible. The battleship's last voyage. No story better illustrates the tragedy of Japan's ammunition crisis than the final sortie of battleship Yamato in April 1945. Yamato was the largest, most powerful battleship ever built. She displaced 72,000 tons, mounted 9 18.1-inch guns that could fire 3,200-pound shells to ranges exceeding 25 miles, had armor up to 26 inches thick. She was magnificent, the ultimate expression of naval power. And by April 1945, she was completely irrelevant. The strategic situation had collapsed beyond recovery. Americans had captured Iwo Jima and invaded Okinawa. American submarines controlled Japan's sea lanes. American B-29s were systematically destroying Japanese cities. The war was lost. Everyone with strategic knowledge understood this. Yamato sat in port, consuming fuel oil, a symbol of power that could no longer be effectively employed. Operation Tengo, Heavenly Operation, was born of desperation and honor that demanded the Navy die fighting rather than surrender intact. The plan? Yamato would sortie to Okinawa with a light destroyer escort, beach herself, and use her massive guns as stationary artillery supporting the defenders. She would fight until destroyed. A one-way mission. The ammunition situation reflected the mission's hopelessness. Yamato sortied with approximately 60% of normal ammunition load, roughly 1,000 shells for her main battery, because that was all that could be spared and because planners knew she wouldn't survive long enough to use more. Each shell weighed over 3,200 pounds and cost roughly what a small car would have cost in pre-war Japan. The shells loaded aboard represented resources Japan could ill afford to lose, but they would be lost anyway because Yamato was going to die. She sailed without air cover. Japan no longer had carrier aircraft to spare. no fuel to operate them, no pilots with sufficient training to provide protection. She sailed knowing American submarines would detect her immediately and American aircraft would find her long before reaching Okinawa. The entire operation was predicated on forlorn hope that she might, through luck or American oversight, actually reach the island before being sunk. Lieutenant Mitsuru Yoshida, one of the handful of survivors, later wrote, "We all knew we were sailing to our deaths. There was no discussion of if we'd be sunk, only when and how." The admiral gave a brief speech about duty and honor and dying for the emperor. But in the wardroom afterward, in quiet conversations, we talked about our families, about what we'd miss, about whether dying like this, in what was effectively a suicide mission, actually served any purpose. American submarines detected her almost immediately. American aircraft found her on April 7th, hundreds of miles from Okinawa. The strike groups were massive, nearly 400 aircraft from multiple carriers, attacking in coordinated waves. Yamato's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, her 25mm and 5-inch guns trying to create defensive fire, but they were completely overwhelmed. The volume of attacking aircraft was too great, coming from too many directions. American pilots pressed attacks through anti-aircraft fire, which killed several aircraft, but most got through because there simply wasn't enough defensive fire to stop them all. This was the arithmetic of ammunition scarcity meeting abundance. Yamato had thousands of anti-aircraft shells, but the attack involved thousands of aircraft sorties, and you can't stop thousands of sorties with thousands of shells when you need dozens per aircraft for real effectiveness. The battleship died slowly, accumulating hits from torpedoes and bombs. Her armor resisted many weapons. She was built to withstand battleship shells, and aircraft weapons were individually less powerful. But hits kept coming, wave after wave, torpedoes opening her hull to the sea, bombs penetrating decks, fires spreading, internal systems failing. She capsized and exploded approximately 2 hours after the first attack, taking 2,500 of her crew with her. She sank with much of her main battery ammunition still aboard, massive 18-inch shells tumbling into the depths, unfired, because she'd never gotten close enough to a target worth shooting at. Those shells represented resources Japan couldn't spare, steel and explosives and machine work that could have been used for something else. But they'd been loaded aboard Yamato because she was going to die anyway, and at least this way those resources would die with her rather than sitting uselessly somewhere waiting for a use that would never come. The numbers that decided a war. The raw production numbers tell a story almost too extreme to believe, yet meticulously documented. In 1944, peak production year, the United States manufactured approximately 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, enough for 300 rounds for every person on Earth. Japan produced approximately 1 billion rounds, less than 3% of American production. For artillery ammunition, the disparity was similar. American industry produced approximately 40 million large-caliber artillery shells in 1944. Japanese production was approximately 5 million rounds, less than a single month of American output. American battleships fired approximately 310,000 shells of various calibers during shore bombardment operations across the Pacific, not including ship-to-ship combat, anti-aircraft fire, or training ammunition. The USS New Jersey, a single Iowa-class battleship, fired over 20,000 shells of all calibers during the war, more ammunition than some entire Japanese naval squadrons carried in combined magazines. Japanese expenditure, by necessity, was far more constrained. The battleship Nagato, which survived the entire war, fired fewer than 700 main battery shells in all combat operations combined, less than some American battleships expended in single-day bombardments. This wasn't incompetence or timidity. It was reality. Japan couldn't produce ammunition at rates approaching American capacity. Even if it could, it couldn't ship ammunition to where it was needed. The logistical system had collapsed, strangled by American submarines and overwhelming American naval superiority. The ammunition disparity wasn't the only factor that decided the Pacific War. American advantages in industrial capacity, technological innovation, training, and leadership all mattered enormously. But ammunition was fundamental. All the tactical brilliance, all the courage, all the sacrifice in the world couldn't overcome the simple arithmetic that American forces could fire 10 shells for every one Japanese shell, could replace losses overnight while Japanese losses were permanent, could fight with freedom and aggression while Japanese forces had to carefully husband dwindling resources. Captain Hara, writing his memoirs in 1952, understood this better than most. We were brave, we were skilled, we were determined, but we were fighting an enemy who could replace in a day what it took us a month to produce, who could fire without thinking while we counted every round. The war was lost before it began, not because American sailors were braver, they weren't necessarily, but because American factories could produce ammunition faster than we could fire it. That was the terrible, simple truth that decided everything.